And the interesting thing that happened was that I felt so good on a mental level and on a personal level. And I just objectively felt from the inside out that kind of this is the answer to the problem, that like this is actually how I should have been eating all along. And in India in particular, we have like clear indications that people have evolutionary adaptations to become like more compatible with a more vegetarian lifestyle. The amount of harm caused by being a vegetarian is significantly lowered. I don't think it's good, and but it doesn't make sense to say that there's one diet that is like the diet of all humans. Could be that a mosquito is as conscious or even more than we are, in which case there's no way we're going to extinguish mosquitoes in order to prevent their suffering or something like that.
All right, welcome. Today we have with us Dr. Diego Caleiro. I'll try to see if I say that correctly. Anyway, he is, I guess, originally from Brazil, but he is in San Diego. Diego, tell us a little your background, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a philosopher and a biological anthropologist by formation. So I'm both a philosopher and a scientist. I was also a member of the effective altruism movement and influenced that to some extent. And I'm also a Bitcoiner, interested in those kinds of things. And actually, one peculiar thing, remember when you had that vegan talking to you that had a lot of like seed oils behind him? Yeah. I have actually an ethical system that is fairly similar to his, even though we completely diverge in our actions and like where we go from there. So
interesting.
That's a little bit
maybe we can jump into that with your philosophy background. And you said a biological What is the difference? Because I guess you have me to describe that a little more, because anthropology is the study of man, and man is a biological creature. So what does the biology part come in?
Most anthropologists are cultural anthropologists, so they study like variations and differences between different human cultures. And biological anthropologists study that, but also have a heavy factor of Darwinism embedded into it. So we also study the evolution of different human groups and different variations and so on and so forth. Everything from like why some people have a double eyelid to differences between biocultural differences between groups and so on. My PhD was about altruism, though. That's my sub area of specialty.
Interesting. You meant double eyelid. So I didn't know that exists. Is that maybe people that dive a lot underwater?
No, the double eyelid is a defense against wind. So in the Siberian and Chinese and Japanese areas, there's a lot of wind. So the reason why East Asians and Native Americans who like later migrated through Siberia have a double eyelid is it's a partial defense against the wind. They also have a flattened face so that your nose doesn't freeze.
Yeah, I've seen some of the facial alterations that are due to environment. I've seen that before, like the size of the nose has to do with the atmosphere and some of the stuff. So it's interesting. So I took a anthropology class in college, and I remember we talked about facial. Some people have longer heads and shorter heads, and the reason behind that, and that was interesting stuff.
It's quite likely that I was a biological anthropologist. So
yeah, perhaps so. I was back at the University of Texas back in the good old days. Tell me, and let's just, I guess, we can talk about what you want to talk about. So you said you have some interest you have a philosophical, I guess, philosophy on nature and food. And I know we had this guy, Nick Hebert was his name, and he's a vegan. He basically advocates, or at least he said he advocates for just the total destruction of all nature and have man take over everything. And maybe, I don't know, turn the world into some sort of zoo. Maybe, I don't know where he was going with that particular, honestly, but so let's discuss what your thoughts are.
Yeah, the principle from which I think Nick and I both are departing is a principle of like utilitarianism. So the world is better if there's more animals and humans experiencing positive things. And I just think that there's some level of short-sightedness in the way that he was conceptualizing all of that. He's just, let's therefore destroy the rainforest because there's a lot of wild animal suffering. But wild animal suffering is a big area within effective altruism, which is a movement that I'm one of the people who helped create and start over. So I had a million discussions with different variations on vegans who think about that kind of thing. And the part that I do agree is that the world is better the more humans and animals that are most happy for the most time in the entire expanse, like how long the universe is going to last. So that's the thing we have in common. And then there's just a lot of divergences that go from there.
I guess my question is, if humans didn't exist, then who would know? About happiness? Is it a moot point? Because if we're not here, who's to say whether these animals are happy or not? I guess they can communicate some level of lack of
Yeah, I mean,
distress,
the
suppose.
great
But
apes have homologous emotions too, like the emotions that we have.
yeah.
So they definitely can experience sadness, joy, grief, and many elephants can experience grief. There's a lot of elephant graveyards, and the
Mm-hmm.
elephants go there and kind of body.
What about
And you can,
I guess there's a point like bunny rabbits, cute little bunny rabbits. Do they care? I
yeah,
don't.
this is like a
I don't.
fascinating
There's a
focus of
certain.
mine, right? Like
Yeah.
up to what point animals experience emotions is one question, and then there's a further question of like up to which point animals are conscious. And having studied philosophy of mind, I did a master's on that. I studied that for 6 years. My take is that basically we don't really know. We don't really know how far down the level of complexity does consciousness go. It could be that a mosquito is as conscious or even more than we are. In which case, there's no way we're going to extinguish mosquitoes in order to prevent their suffering or something like that. So it makes no sense to go in that general direction.
Yeah, there's actually people will say that plants have consciousness and they're able to communicate through chemical signals and they can hear sounds, they can emit sounds and they talk to each other. And when there's distress, they warn the others around them and they can respond to damage and pain just like other organisms.
What is the key word there? The X are conscious.
That plants actually experience all of those in some form or fashion, and therefore we shouldn't.
We have far more robust reasons to believe that plants are not conscious, or even, for example, mollusks, right? Which is why there are so many austro-vegans who eat mollusks but don't eat any other form of decent, healthy, nutritious protein.
Yeah. So what is, explain maybe for those that aren't familiar, and to be honest, I'm not that familiar with the term effective altruism. I know altruism and I know what effective means. What does that mean?
Effective altruism is a movement that was like started and headed mostly from Berkeley and Oxford, but also some other branches in Brazil and Melbourne. It's basically a group of people who come from philosophy and cognitive sciences, CS, and other sciences, and are trying to not only have, to have a very scientific manner of making the world a better place by the most effective means possible. And a lot of them are dedicating their lives to that. Conditional on your particularities, it might be donating the maximum amount to a particular charity that is most effective. Some people evaluate different charities in order to make sure that there's the same level of effectiveness in charity as there is in like a capitalist system where there's competition and that sort of thing. And there's some people like me who think about the far future and are trying to gather crucial considerations about the far future to try to make sure that the future of humanity and our descendants goes as well as possible.
That's an interesting topic because there's some people will talk about the sort of the concept of human flourishing. And is that the ultimate overarching yardstick by which we measure things? Or should we say that maybe it won't be so good for humans, but it'll be better for the dung beetles and the canaries and things like that? Where do you fall on that spectrum of, is it about humans primarily and then everything else is subservient to that? Or is it like humans are just another bug, another creature on the planet?
I'm in the middle in the sense that I have a moderate preference for minds that are more or less like mine. But the thing that I have a very strong preference for humans is basically that we are the only symbolic species on Earth. So we are the steerers of the vessel that can take us to colonize space. So because humans are the only intelligent species, we are the only ones who can like cause the destiny of whatever comes after, whether it's more humans or something else. So because of that responsibility, I also think that we should eat the most nutritious food, even if that turns out to cause a small amount of like deaths and suffering and so on, because at the other end of the spectrum, we're talking about 10 to the 30, 10 to the 35 potential lives that we could lead through our descendants and so on and so forth. So I'm very pro-human in that sense, but in the same sense that Elon Musk is pro-human. That is because humans are a great vessel to create as many great minds in the future as possible. Hopefully human.
Yeah, interesting. I know with some of the rise of AI, maybe we'll be all subservient to these robots or something like that. But one of the concerns I have around the aspirations to colonize space is I just don't know if we can reproduce in space, particularly without the gravity that humans have evolved with. As you said, environment impacts how we develop. Sure. And without 1G gravity, then it's not even clear that a human embryo can develop appropriately because we have a lot of the cellular signaling and different longitudinal growth that occurs in utero is dependent upon the gravity. And so if we can't somehow figure out how to maintain 1G gravity for an entire pregnancy on a different planet, it could be just maybe technically prohibitive or next to impossible. I know they've had some experiments in space where they grow animals in utero out in space in low gravity, and some of them survive. Some of the lower animals survive, but I'm not sure if the higher ones do. So
Cellular
anyway,
signaling.
it's an interesting.
It's a very precarious sub-area of biology. My advisor at Berkeley, he was actually the first person to figure out how to make a human axon in an adult grow towards a particular target. And the way he did that is by inserting human axons, inserting pig axons. The problem is that they only lasted a few years. So even though it would help people recover for a while, like it was discontinued as a form of treatment back in 85 or something like that.
So it's a scaffold, basically a directional scaffold to tell the cells which way to go. Because you're right. When you're dealing with nerve injuries, it'll grow 1 millimeter a week or something like that. So if you've got like 10 inches, it might take years to see recovery in that regard. And then it can be disorganized. And I've done some nerve transplants in orthopedics where you take something called the end of the posterior near-osseous nerve and you replace a digital nerve with that. And it can take a long time and there's no guarantee that it'll work right. But I guess let's get to some of the meat and potatoes, if you will, of what is it, if we're going to engage in effective altruism and we're going to have a better planet for many generations down the road. What are you suggesting we do?
I do think that that's where the main disagreement between me and Nick goes, which is because I believe that humans are the only symbolic species that we know of, and we have reasons to believe that there is no other life in the visible universe. There are mathematical, complicated reasons that I won't get super into, but let's just assume for the time being that humans are the only intelligent species. Then I do think that we need to let our cognition work as well as possible. And as someone who has tried the carnivore diet, and a few times I have succeeded, a few times ADHD drove me away from the wagon. But in the times I have succeeded, I've experienced like how both in terms of how you feel better, level of calm, ability to cognize, and like accurate perception of the future, and so on and so forth. It seems to me like the sacrifice being done is very moderate, especially compared to the amount of animals that have been eaten by our 110 billion ancestors is enormous. So my take is basically that humans should continue to eat meat for as long as that's the healthiest and most nutritious way to transform our cognition into both something that can experience pleasure, but also something that can give pleasure to those who come after us. That's basically the idea there.
Yeah, I guess let's go back into you. Let's put your biological anthropology hat back on, because it's my understanding that human cognition might have peaked circa 100,000 years ago. We had larger endocranial cats, which suggests a larger brain volume, maybe 1,500 cc's compared to, say, 1,300 cc's on average.
Yeah.
And we were probably eating a more nutritious diet, arguably. Certainly, we had a lot fewer humans to support back then, and we had a much more higher access to animal fat. I know some people will argue that, and there's pretty decent evidence that we used to eat a lot of things like elephants, which you mentioned are quite sentient and quite intelligent. We used to hunt these so-called, mastodons, mammoths, elephants, proboscideans. I think there was a period of time, I read a nice book from, what was his name? Ed Mead's dad, called Megafauna, I think. And they talk about the early food of early humans was actually these big turtles, these giant tortoises that used to walk all over the land, and they were huge, and they were pretty much without predators because they just went into their shells and nothing could eat them. But humans figured out how to flip them over and crack their shells open, and then and they were very slow moving, so we just feasted on them.
I just came back from the Galapagos Islands, which still has that form of gigantism. So gigantism tends to happen when an animal goes into an island environment, and in that island environment, there's no natural predators, and then they grow giant. So I took some pictures of 40-year-old turtles that are bigger than me.
I'll have to ask you that, because I'm actually going to be there in November.
Oh, it's awesome. Stay more days than you're planning.
So, okay, well, I think we've got 6 or 7 days.
That's good. That's good. I stayed only 3.5 days, so it was awesome, though.
Yeah. So good. It's good to hear that. So it's right off the coast of Ecuador. My geography. So intelligence has a multivariate components, right? So the fact that now we have writing in the internet and cultural transmission and memetics and so on and so forth, like probably the peak of individual human intelligence was around the year 1790. So not that long ago, about 230 years ago. But the brain size of humans might have been a good correlate for intelligence, although a better correlate is the disparity between the brain size and the body size.
So elephants they have like bigger brains than us. Whales have very big
Right.
brains, and they're not necessarily comparably smart to other animals like a chimpanzee that has a much smaller brain, or a crow for that matter. Crows are extraordinarily intelligent.
Whales could be smart. They could be smarter than we think we are. It's just hard. They got their own deal. They're very dissimilar to us. Whereas primates, you can see, like you said, they can understand. I think there's some animals that have a vocabulary of thousands of words. Some of these gorillas in captivity that
Yeah.
I've seen, or chimpanzees rather. One of the things, and you said, so human brain power maybe peaked in the late 1700s, which would coincide with the American Revolution, the French Revolution, maybe some of these cultural revolutions that occurred.
Right.
One of the things I see today is it doesn't take a lot of intelligence to survive in today's society for the most part. And it's very easy to acquire food, which is something that for most of society, you got to figure out how to acquire your own food. And now all you got to do is take your phone and swipe. You don't even have to do anything. You don't even have to move, literally. So I think we're getting dumber are we getting dumber as a society, as a species? Is that an argument you could make?
There's a great book about that called The End of Our Wits by Ed Dutton and Michael Woodley of Mini, who are great researchers in like intelligence and behavior genomics and intelligence. But what you said is true, that like the reason why it might be that we were the most intelligent at that time is a combination of the Industrial Revolution generated so much output in proportion to how fast we were producing, that now we allow a much wider variety of genomes to survive. And then medicine was also like much more developed with once we learned what bacteria were and so on and so forth. So basically, we've improved our capability of sustaining alive people who developmentally would have turned out to be less intelligent in other times. So that's part of it. The other thing is just like there's a lot of selective pressures for smarter people to move to the cities. People who move to the cities stop having children, so that there's a very strong selective pressure to stop having children the smarter you are. There's also some inverse correlation with religion, which people think is the main correlate, but the main correlate is actually living in cities versus living in rural areas.
Interesting. So living in cities leads to less genetic passing down. But it's interesting because I look at, if you go to the bottom of the ocean, like way down to Mariana Trench or something, somewhere really deep, there's fish swimming around there that don't have eyes because they don't need them anymore. They're eyeless fish.
Right.
And yet I think about just in my lifetime, when I go on a trip somewhere, I got to have a damn GPS or I can't find my way. When I was a kid, or young adult, I used to use maps, and I could probably still do it, but I would struggle with that. And now with the advent of AI, where you don't have to think anymore. The AI tell me what to think. And so we may be like becoming eyeless fish, instead we become semi-brainless humans. I don't need any of these higher functions because I can outsource it out to AI and let them do it for me. And I don't know. We'll see if we'll go that direction.
One way to conceptualize that is just think like, where is the level of intelligence, right? Is the intelligence at the level of cells? Is the intelligence at the level of humans? That's the thing that peaked in 1790. Or is the intelligence at the group level? And like in our society, obviously the intelligence is significantly higher. Like the points of peak intelligence are significantly higher than the individual levels. Like individuals can only know so much. I've done some research in AI. Do you know who Nick Bostrom is? He wrote the book Superintelligence.
I do not know.
Okay, yeah, he's a philosopher based in Oxford, and he's basically the world's expert in thinking about like far future scenarios related to AI. And yeah, I do think that AI is basically going to make our lives easier and easier and easier, up to a point where I find it quite likely, for mix of evolutionary and computational reasons, that it will cause our extinction with a pretty high probability. So I expect to live a very good life until like it ends abruptly because an AI destroyed everyone.
Interesting. Hopefully it'll be beyond my lifetime and my kids' lifetime, stuff like that. But this is the meme that goes around. AI makes for easier times than we have weaker men, and weaker men lead to harder times, and so on and so forth. So maybe we shouldn't make it too easy. Maybe we shouldn't make it too easy on ourselves. I think there's something to be said for human resilience. And I guess we have people right now where the slightest sort of headwind, they're like, I can't deal with this. This is too much for me because it's always been so easy up to this point. So I don't know. I always hear from the generation before. When I went to school, it was uphills in snow both ways, and it's much tougher in my day. And to a degree it was, but at the same time, I'm sleeping in a climate controlled bed, and thankfully at night, I'm thankful for it. I'm not outside being eaten by mosquitoes and sweating and all this stuff that humans did for some.
Boomers.
Yeah, go ahead.
The boomers were the wealthiest generation, right? But that doesn't mean necessarily that people would trade. I don't think most millennials would trade to live life like in a prior period, because then we wouldn't have access to all the other conveniences in the internet and so on. And also like the fraction of the population of the world that is living in a pretty positive condition that I think both of us are in now, which is that we don't really have to do any specific thing in order to sustain ourselves anymore. That fraction is basically expanding in part because of automation, but in part because of many other processes. So like economic expansion is so large that there are people now who have almost total freedom with their time and don't have to be like chopping wood in the forest to cook whatever gazelle we hunted yesterday.
Yeah,
So,
there's definitely a trade-off. I can see it. I'm like, it's nice when you can go to the store to go drive and pick up some meat rather than having to walk 6 miles. And
yeah. Do you feel like your life is purposeless because you can probably afford to live with, if you stop doing the podcast and if you stop, you could probably afford to live for quite a while, right? Do you feel like your life is purposeless because of that? And I tend to feel like not, but I do know that many people who are high in conscientiousness tend to experience that their sense of purpose is attached to their job or to their ability to like procure an income or raise cows or whatever.
Oh, my personal, no, I've got some diverse interests and they're not all related to what I'm doing as an occupation, but certainly, I enjoy it. I wouldn't do it if I didn't enjoy it. And I enjoy a lot of things. There's stuff that's there and I think I could always find something to do. Like I said, that's the whole point of life, is not just to watch Netflix specials on repeat until the end of time. Hopefully not for most people. For some people, it's that way. And we see there's obviously a lot of, I'm sure there's always been problems in society. There's always been violence. And some people will argue that it's worse today, but you go back historically. And I think the odds of you being killed in violence today is so much lower than it was even a few hundred years ago, or dying of some natural disaster or infection. It's just, we've vastly improved our survivability as humans. That's why life expectancy is longer in many ways.
Oh, it's incomparable. Like 30% of the males in like several different Amazonian tribes die through like direct violence, arrow to the face or something like that. But yeah, we are like, even in the worst part of Detroit, the level of violence is significantly lower than anywhere in the Neolithic society.
Yeah, I think a lot of the fossil records shows signs of broken bones and violent death, and if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, you probably know that better than I do.
Yeah, do you know
about what? Oh, Otzi, yeah, the 5,000-year-old frozen guy they found up in Siberia or wherever the hell they found him.
I think he had an arrow to some part of his body. Like there's definitely like violence in his bones in some capacity. I don't remember the details, but
yeah. Interesting. So let me just delve quickly, if you don't mind, into what drew you to doing a carnivore? That's obviously, I don't know, because you said you came from Brazil. I know Brazil has a very significant meat culture, particularly in the South, if I'm not mistaken, where the gaucho population, I think, and everybody I've talked to said Brazil's got some great meat, but it's still,
yeah, Brazil is the world's farm. We feed about 1 billion people a year, so significantly more than the population, which is 230 something million, I believe. When I was a child, I was part of that culture because my dad owned cattle. So I actually helped raise cattle. I helped. I was a little kid, but I hung out in farms in Brazil and in cattle farms in Brazil for a little bit when I was a kid. There's a massive farm culture there. It's also, I think, the country where meat is the cheapest because we have fewer cows than India, but they're not sacred. So there's that. And so what drove me to carnivore diet was basically, I have a massive amount of ADHD, which you can probably tell by speech pressure, like the frequency with which I interrupted you, the variation in the topics that I'm discussing, and so on and so forth. And because of that, I got impulsive, and all my ancestors who had ADHD got obese at some point in their lives, and so did I. So I've been trying to fix that for quite a long time, and I've tried, give or take 15, 16 different strategies before. And then I started doing a carnivore diet. And the interesting thing that happened was that I felt so good on a mental level and on a personal level. And I just objectively felt from the inside out that kind of this is the answer, not necessarily to the problem that I'm overweight, but to the problem that like this is actually how I should have been eating all along. So it was mostly like, I received a bunch of mental benefits I wasn't even trying to get. And then I was like, okay, I'm doing this for the long run. And then I've watched thousands of hours of content about it since. So pretty familiar with a lot of it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you mentioned, because most people don't realize that India has the largest herd of cattle on the planet Earth, and Brazil is second. And you're right. in India, they have a lot of sacred cows, and they still export quite a few of them. They actually slaughter. Actually, India slaughters more cows every year than the United States does. Most people don't know. They slaughter about 38 million. We in the United States slaughter about 34 million. So that's an interesting,
Wow.
just an interesting fact that many people don't realize. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I know a lot about cow stuff. I got a lot of kind of random cow data stuck in my head for various reasons. But so you said some eight, I think the conversation is fine. I don't detect any pressure or anything like that. But so you did the diet for various times on and off, and beneficial to you? Yes, no? What are your thoughts?
Right. It's so beneficial that I did priming. So for a little while, I was actually eating a very significant amount, like 15 days.
Mm-hmm.
And during the priming period, I actually increased in weight. And despite increasing in weight, and despite like my main purpose for the diet having been to like try to decrease my weight, I still decided to keep on going because it just felt like my health just feels significantly better, like both cognitively and body wise, like the level of energy, the excitement, the baseline level of happiness has increased a little bit, even though mine is already pretty high by nature. But yeah, so and then I started seeing the testimonials of other people, and I'm like, okay, so there's like all these diseases that if I were going to contract them, I will not actually acquire them if I do this diet, or like the probability would be significantly lowered. And like, why wouldn't I do that? If you allow me to be nitpicky about one thing about India, that I want to correct something that I've seen so many carnivores say that's incompatible with the anthropological record, which is the idea that there's a normal or a natural human diet, like for all humans. And different humans evolved in completely different conditions, right? The double eyelid that we mentioned, different types of personalities, different adaptations to like forest systems, cold systems, island systems, and so on. I think the idea that there's one human normal diet or one human, Homo sapiens level diet, it's a very strange assertion. And in India in particular, we have like clear indications that people have evolutionary adaptations to become like more compatible with a more vegetarian lifestyle. So I think that like the amount of harm caused by being a vegetarian is significantly lowered in South Asians because they evolved to deal with that, and in some of the people in South Sudan and other places that evolved that sort of diet. I don't think it's good, and but it doesn't make sense to say that there's one diet that is like the diet of all humans.
Yeah, let me ask you just on that, because a couple things I think about, because humans are the most geographically diverse species on planet Earth as far as mammals and things of that nature are.
Yeah.
So we have adapted to everything: Arctic temperatures, deserts, tropical jungles, mountains, so on and so forth. So we can live everywhere. And the one consistent food that you find in all those places is some form of animal, which are all 100% of animals are edible. I would say that meat is something that every evolutionary niche that humans have occupied has been accessible as part of that diet. Whereas I can't get tropical fruits in Canada, right, and particularly in the winter. And so I think that the idea that meat as part of the diet is probably consistent across the species. And again, obviously, if we go back to the evolutionary model where we all came out of Africa, I know there's some people that maybe even question that, but certainly there's some meat was there when we originated in wherever the hell it was, Ethiopia as a Homo sapiens. And
right. So like there was meat all along.
Well, yeah, I mean, but the other question I wanted to ask you is because the history of vegetarianism of India, and correct me if I'm wrong, goes back maybe just a couple thousand years, maybe even less than that. So how long for human evolution and the environmental, how long does it take to adapt to, say, a dietary change? Like some people will say agriculture goes back to circa around 10,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, and we expanded from there. And so it's been 10,000 years of us eating wheat, and some people are more adapted to it than others are. What are your thoughts on how long it takes for this evolutionary pressure in humans?
I've seen a presentation by, I don't think it was a carnivore advocate, so someone related that. He made a point that I find very agreeable, which is the level of adaptation that we have for different things requires different amounts of time depending on how old you are. And here's what I mean by that. The highest level of selection pressure is when you're a spermatozoid, and then when you're a baby, and so on and so forth. If you make it to reproduction, then you're already like, you have some likelihood of leaving descendants. You might not get to be a good grandpa, and so on and so forth. So what I do think is that like there might be a case to be made for the idea that in those 10, 15,000 years that we've been eating a significantly more vegetable-based diet, that younger people are able to tolerate that best. But then the structures that evolved in order to protect and react to that, those structures start to break down as you age because of the process of aging in general, and just because there hasn't been enough selective pressure in people at an older age. So I do think that the older you are, the more carnivore you should be. I think that anyone who's evolutionarily old, which is about 35, should probably start eating, to a first approximation, just meat and almost nothing else because of that. So like, it does take fewer than a couple thousand years to have some sort of change, replying to your question more directly. And one of the ways in which you know that, like with more acuity, is that there's rice cultures and wheat cultures in China, and they manifest very differently. Like the wheat culture selected out the ADHD genes, but no, the rice culture selected out the warrior gene, the ADHD gene, the R7 variation of the DRD4 gene. And those are like what cause people to be more individualistic in part here in the States and so on and so forth. There is variation caused by food and by how you grow food as well, because that requires a specific set of behaviors, right? To grow rice requires a lot of conscientiousness and hardworking labor and harmonization with the people around you and so on and so forth. And that causes a lot of the psychological and social differences between like China and the United States, for example.
What are your thoughts? This is maybe an related topic, but there is obviously evidence that we interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovians and other species along our journey.
1.2% Denisovan, if I recall.
Yeah, and I think it varies by population, whereas maybe sub-Saharan Africans have almost no Neanderthal, whereas I think I saw the highest percentage of Neanderthals being in East Asians.
The highest percentage
and
Denisovan,
there may be...
I might be wrong about that.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, but it's something like that there's a difference between, and because of that, Neanderthals were clearly more carnivorous than maybe even Homo sapiens, clearly or arguably. So maybe there's some tendency. It's interesting that, and I'm sure there's a lot of reasons to go, but if you look at like human IQ, the highest IQs in the world are clustered parts of Hong Kong and Macau and some of these other places, and then less so in other places. And maybe there's a relationship to who
Hong Kong is drawing from a very large population, and there's a million correlated factors. So East Asians in general have a higher average IQ. So like the order is East Asians and then Caucasians and sub-Saharan Africans. But amongst East Asians, the population of China has a wide distribution. And then the richest people and the people who can afford the most meat move to Hong Kong and work there. And they will have also like more freedom loving principles of the sort that causes a person to be more likely to be a meat eater, in the same sense that a redneck in the United States is more likely to be a farmer, a Republican. All those people are more likely to be meat eaters.
What do you think that is? Why do you think it is that meat eating is associated with some sense of freedom? Because in my book, I touched on that at the end, and I thought diet, it is about freedom in a way to some degree. What are your thoughts on that?
The first time that I've heard about the carnivore diet was in the first time that like Jordan Peterson mentioned it on Rogan. And at the time I decided, okay, there isn't enough data for this. I'm going to give it 5 years and then I'll think about it again. And that's why I started last year. But the first time I basically did carnivore at home, whatever, outside home. I literally ate like all sorts of things. And at that time, the ADHD caught me. Bring me back to the question and I'll connect that to what you're saying.
About the relationship between the perception of freedom and the desire to eat meat.
At that time, I realized that I was feeling much more like I moved towards the right wing to some extent. And I think that was caused biochemically by the meat. So I do think that there might actually be an effect in the other direction. I think that meat, I know that strength correlates with like conservatism and republicanism in the United States and like torso size, that kind of thing. And just like health biomarkers in general. So it might be that like eating meat itself causes you to be like stronger, more likely to like lean conservative or Republican. I think so.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was actually a recent study came out. It showed that actually testosterone levels were correlated. The more testosterone you had, the more likely you were to be more conservative, and the less you tended to be less conservative. And it was able to, and it was shifted when people were supplemented with testosterone. So it's not surprising me that the nutrition could have even an impact on your thoughts. So maybe that's dangerous because maybe they'll try to ban meat now because they don't want people becoming more conservative in their thought. It's an interesting sort of dilemma that we have there. And in where you're from in Brazil, I know the former president Bolsonaro was more conservative, and now Lula was the new guy. And I know there's a lot
Lula
of
is in his third presidency. He was president while I was still in Brazil.
So he came back again, and so I know there's a lot of grumbling going on, and to say for about, I think there's people that are just pissed off about some of the stuff around freedom. And I don't know if the diet is shifting in Brazil. Are you in touch with people from home or no?
Let me take the testosterone thing and then bring it to Brazil. So with apologies to like Sapolsky and Deacon, my advisor, because I'm going to ground the concept of testosterone to a very simplified metric, but to some extent, testosterone in males is where you feel like, to some extent, it correlates to where you feel like you are in the mating hierarchy. So to some extent, if you feel like you're in a good position in life, that you have enough status or that you have access to mates or something like that, this is highly correlated to testosterone. So it makes sense that if you have a scale, the people on the bottom of the scale who are more likely to want to shift the scale and change the functioning of the system are going to be the people with low testosterone, and conversely, people with high testosterone, because the more safety you have in your social grounding, the more your hormones are going to interact in that particular way. You're going to have higher levels of serotonin and higher levels of testosterone. Bringing back to Brazil, Bolsonaro represents a very different thing from what most of Brazilian politics had been for quite a while, for basically the 30 years since the military dictatorship ended. And Brazil was moving towards the left, like, rather fast. Like, every politician in Brazil was basically like Bernie or more to the left of that in comparison to the USA. And Bolsonaro brought like a big, massive shift. At the time, I was very favorable to him because I thought that like the pendulum had swung too far in one direction and I wanted to push him back. So I actually defended and advocated for Bolsonaro in his first election quite a bit. After that 4 years passed, I thought that he had already done the like pendulum swinging, and I didn't care that much anymore. I was also less invested because I had not been living in the country for 4 more years.
Interesting. So when you're in San Diego right now, obviously nice weather. Are you working what do you do, I guess, as far as, are you teaching at a university? Or
I finished my PhD a little while ago, and thanks to our Lord and Savior Bitcoin, I have the freedom of not taking a professorship yet. So I have decided for a little while not to do that. I'm reconsidering. So I think within the next year and a half, I might be looking for like interesting things to do and opportunities. But because I lack financial incentives and I have like massive ADHD, it's like I end up doing whatever gives me dopamine in any particular day, whether that be a steak, going out rollerblading, chatting with Shawnbaker in his podcast, or writing essays on Facebook, Twitter, or TikTok, or So
I guess the Bitcoin thing, because that's interesting, because I am interested in Bitcoin, not to the extent that some other people are, but one of my friends, Saifedean Amos, wrote Bitcoin Standard. He's a carnivore guy. Some of the other guys, did a podcast with Robert Breedlove down in Key Biscayne a few weeks ago, and he pointed out Michael Saylor's yacht out there in Indian Creek in Miami.
Like, so smart people. I spent my life like flying to find the smartest people in the world. Saylor is a very intelligent, like shockingly so. The guys you mentioned, Saifedean is pretty smart too, and so on. But Saylor is at the level that I would call brilliant. He's a very interesting character. Yeah.
Yeah, he's definitely got an interesting position within the Bitcoin world. He's basically trying to buy as much as he possibly can and leverage his entire company into that. And so far he's been right. If you look at his valuation, he's probably triple on whatever he's invested. So, so far so good. I
got in before him. I'm leaving after him. And as a fraction of my course, I'm like more invested than him because he has gazillions, right? So he's not actually staking anything of significance in the sense that what is he going to lose if Bitcoin goes to zero? A couple of yachts? Like, that's not going to change his. Yeah. Would you say that you're invested to the point where like it would actually make a difference in how your life is going to go in the future?
Not as much as I was. I was very hesitant for a number of years. Honestly, I just didn't. I had too many other things going on. And so when I finally started investing, it was a few years ago. So it's not, if you'd have been in 10 years ago, then you're like, okay, life's good. Depending. And again, it's always, the longer this persists, the more people that recognize that there is some value in there, because value is just attributed to whatever people decide is valuable. It's like, why do we think gold is valuable? Because it's shiny and
Yeah.
scarce, and we can make pretty jewelry out of it, and so on and so forth. But if you have hundreds of millions of people now saying Bitcoin is worth whatever they say it is, then it is what it is. Can it go to zero?
Like philosophical
Who
Bitcoin
knows?
in the sense that Bitcoin is it's an invariant transformer in the sense that it will be representing a significantly larger and larger fraction of the world economy. No one knows exactly what is the limit upper point. Saylor guesses it's 50%, but then again, who knows if he's not just incentivized to think that. But it's going to continue acting as a quasar, as a black hole that's absorbing an enormous amount of economic and kinetic energy and making a few people rich in the process who managed to get in the first 30, 40 years that it's going to be around. So that's basically us, and everybody who buys in the next 15, 20 years. It's probably going to continue outgrowing the economy by a significant margin for quite a bit of time.
Yeah, it's, I guess, market cap right now is 1.3 trillion. There's a decent amount of money into it right now. So, or a decent amount of whatever you want to call it.
Even just the past gold,
capital,
which will probably happen within the next decade or two, that's only a 9x from now. And everything that is money, right? Everything, there's many different things we use as money, and they have different levels of goodness in how good they are as money. But Bitcoin is better than all those things at being money, including gold, silver, and many other forms and representations of money and all the other crypto tokens and all that stuff. So it's going to keep absorbing that until we basically know how much we want the economy to be objects versus how much we want the economy to be money. And that's going to be the final metric of Bitcoin, plus some added kind of variation based off whether people are predicting or not that states are going to emit a lot of currency, right? So it's like a hedge against inflation and a hedge against government corruption in general.
Let me bring us back to food, because you've got this sort of obviously interesting perspective of the future. And you mentioned the effect of altruism. And there's a lot of people that are critical of the way we raise food now. And I think for good reasons on all sides, plant side, animal side, there's issues. Sustainability. Some people argue that there's a lot of people out there making the argument we just need to give up meat. It's not good for the planet, or vastly reduce our consumption. How do you put together the concept of let's do what's best for the overall planet, including all the creatures that live on there, and still allow humans to obtain optimal nutrition?
We got to think about different groups actually have very different interests in that regard, because saving the planet can actually mean something like saving the maximum amount of biodiversity, which might be an interesting goal. And I think it's valuable to have some level of biodiversity, which is what that vegan guy hated. Saving the planet could mean make as many animals as possible and as many humans as possible have the best mental states, which I'm all for. But I have a counter argument basically to the argument of the people who say, therefore, we shouldn't eat meat because of that, which is basically the vast wide majority of animals that there will ever be have not been born yet. The enormous majority of animals that will exist in our universe will exist more than 100 years from now. So there's no point in stopping eating meat now in order to save a moderate few quadrillion, a couple quintillion animals, if there's going to be octillion and nontillion and decillions later. So as long as we get AI right and avoid extinction, we can get to a path where eventually we're going to be benefiting all minds that can be easily benefited by using whatever resources we have. So I do think that it's a great initiative to scientifically try to create meat that doesn't have a nervous system, which they're trying to do in a lab. And eventually, I hope it gets to a point where it is nutritionally indistinguishable to our bodies. And at that point, and not a second before that, then I will advocate for veganism. But I will be a ferocious fighter against veganism up till that second. And I want a chemist to not be able to distinguish those two things, because I think it's extremely dangerous to have some sort of totalitarian overhaul trying to say, hey, no, it's already good enough, eat the bugs, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think the issue with the lab-grown meat, the cell culture meat, or whatever, maybe they come up with some other scheme, is right now there's a preconceived notion about what is healthy. And it's one of the problems we see with some of these chat GPTs. You see who trains the algorithms.
Right.
And it's like you ask ChatGPT, hey, tell me about why meat is healthy for you. And they say, actually, it's not healthy for you. And you should not, you see this
It's so annoying.
pre-programming that's going in there.
ChatGPT is my
So,
doctor,
yeah,
so
but
it's so annoying when he says that because I'm always like, oh, damn. Actually, I sent you my blood test, so check it out later because I don't know if I'm dying or not.
you don't look like you're dying. You look like you're in pretty good shape at the moment. But it's interesting because with the cell cultured stuff, there's some people will say it's just technically not feasible, at least not in the near foreseeable future. And all these Silicon Valley venture capital people that have invested a few $1 billion are now just like regretting it. And the investment has gone down significantly in some place, at least out of the private capital. Maybe some of the governments are trying to prop it up. I know Canada has invested money, US has invested money. And the question is, what my point was that if they say, well, we're going to design a better meat, and they're going to say, we're going to make it low in saturated fat and high in these novel fats that we're going to create that. And so it could be. And the other thing the interesting thing about just like, for instance, beef is it's not just a few nutritional products. It's not just a little bit of amino acids and some fat and a few vitamins and minerals. There's 50, 60, 70,000 unique nutritional compounds that are in fat, including all these phytotoxins, the polyphenols, the tannins, and whatever, all that's in there. And so how do you accurately recreate that? And then how do you test it in humans and see what the outcome? One of the problems is we don't even test actual meat in humans yet. That's the problem.
It can be made so one thing that would facilitate that is just make it out of meat. Like we are made of meat, and our cells can just be transformed into cells that would reproduce without having any form of like neuronal system. Just
I guess it depends what you feed them to. It's like, where's the food come from? Because you're gonna say it's got some growth medium, it's got some protein, some glucose probably, and so the criticisms is they're not just growing out of thin air. You've got to feed them massive amounts of inputs, which have to be harvested in right now monocrop agriculture, which just perpetuates the degradative systems.
I have a curiosity about that. So there's a lot of carnivores who don't like grass-fed beef. And my understanding is like, why would we want to eat? There's a lot of carnivores that have histamine or some other negative reaction from eating pigs or chickens because they don't have multiple stomachs. Why wouldn't you want the cow to eat something that is more human compatible, whatever, soy corn, some other human food versus grass, which humans can't digest? I think that maybe the reason why grass-fed milk and beef tastes worse might be that some humans actually have some sort of resistance and are actually detecting something negative from the grass that even though it was a ruminant animal, like it might not have fully digested it.
I eat a lot of both. I like grass-finished meat. I eat grain-finished meat. I'm more likely to find grass-finished beef that I don't like, honestly, just to take because it's got an off flavor. And I've seen some really good grass-finished beef. It just depends on how it's finished, to be honest. And it probably takes more skill and more time to finish on grass than it does to grain. But I think one of the things is that if we go back in time when humans were eating these mammoths and mastodons, they were requiring a lot more fat in the diet. And then according to guys like Mickey Van Dor and Rafi Sertoli, Reina Barca, said that about somewhere maybe 80,000 years ago, we saw a pretty big die-off of these big megafaunal animals. And so now we're left hunting these smaller, the antelopes, chasing them around. We developed range technology, the atlatls, the bow and arrow technology. And so now we're eating leaner cuts of meat, and we have to supplement it with energy, and that's coming from the plant sources. So if we're going to go back to our carnivorous roots, say 100,000, 200,000, 2.5 million years ago, whenever we want to say humans started, then we have to figure out a way to get more fat in it. And the best way to get more animal fat is an animal that's got more fat on it. And that's going to be a grain fat cow versus an elephant.
I never eat chickens. I only eat ducks and duck eggs because they're just fattier and they taste much better to me. Like chickens taste weird and strange. But so it's the same idea. Like grass fat will also be leaner, right? So it's just a hypothesis. It could be that the grass is actually bad for some people because it hasn't been like transformed enough to not to be fully compatible with.
We don't have good human outcome studies on grass versus grain finish. There's very few. There's vanishing. There's like a study out of Texas A&M. They did a study in Australia comparing kangaroo meat versus grain finished cows, which is not even the same animal. So it wasn't a very good study. But anyway, Diego, unfortunately, we're out of time, man. I got to go. Tell people where they can find. Are you on social media? Do you have any?
The Last in Black Pro hat. I'm on TikTok. If you want to debate and write things back, Facebook's probably the best medium. I do a lot of that. And on those places, I use Diego with a G because that reminds Americans of pronouncing like Diego. and I'm also on Twitter. So those are like the three social medias that I actually use. I want to correct one thing from the record, putting my philosophy hat real quick, that a lot of carnivores speak about like the natural human diet, and there's this natural fallacy or the Aesop problem. The general idea that like because something is natural, then it is necessarily good. The essence of nature is more something like a wasp that poisons something from the inside, paralyzes a mouse and and allows its eggs to hatch and eat it from the inside out. The assumption that a natural human diet is a good human diet, I think, is an incorrect assumption. And I think that the people who are advocating for that to be like the way in which we talk about the carnivore diet is wrong. You can talk about an optimal diet or a proper diet, but like being natural doesn't mean it's good. And also the carnivore diet isn't a natural human diet because there's no natural diet for the entire species that is, as you said, the most widespread on the planet. It is a
Yeah.
universal, like eating meat is a universal for sure, as you said, but
Yeah,
that's
fair enough.
different
Fair
from being
enough.
natural. Yeah.
Yeah, and fair enough. And I like that's all nice and good. We don't have a time machine. We can't go back anyway. What's happening today? I base my thing on results today, and that's why I promote this diet. Anyway, Diego, thank you so much. I do have to go though, so I'm gonna stop recording now. And